So on this video, what we're going to go ahead and do is take a look at the beginning chains versus the foundation stitch, which I have used both in projects. They have their benefits and cons as well, so just kind of going over how to start projects with the tapestry crochet, what's the easiest way not to get too discouraged once you see something like 300 chains or 300 beginning stitches to start. That can be pretty intimidating, as well as just finding the motivation to keep going. Always the first couple rows are going to be the hardest to get started. Chains are flimsy, there's a lot of almost dragging, the piece won't hang right for a while until you get quite a few rows on there. So definitely just want to go over kind of how I start projects. If anybody has different ways about doing it, that's perfectly fine. I'm totally into learning new techniques and sharing that as I go. So mainly to get started, if you are working, let's say, a regular chain to start the piece, I always make sure that to increase the hook size quite substantially for that beginning chain. So obviously my camera is not all that happy to focus on these, so I'll definitely have some screenshots of these two hooks. So mainly my pieces, I use a 3.25 millimeter hook. This is a steel hook, and basically that's going to give you the gauge as well as the detail that you want. The problem with beginning a chain with this small of a hook is it's going to be very, very tight. So as you start making the piece and crocheting into the tiny little chains that you start with, you'll start getting a bowing effect, where that chain gets kind of stretched, and it'll basically, instead of being a flat piece, it'll be a rainbow shape at the end. So if you are going to be using beginning chains, always increase your hook size. Basically make sure that your chain matches the gauge. So like usually I work in a gauge of 18 stitches over 9 rows, so I want to make sure that, and that's a 4-inch square, so I want to make sure that when I chain I have 18 chains in 4 inches. So definitely increase the hook size. To begin with, we just slip stitch. This is a medium weight yarn that I use commonly. The label on there, it'll just say, hey, we want a 5.5 millimeter hook, which is perfectly fine. I'm using a 5 millimeter just because that's what I had handy. And then when you want to chain, you do want to make sure you chain loosely. So almost make sure that the chain feels too loose in projects like this, because you are carrying colors. Those stitches kind of, they're going to stretch your piece, your beginning chain, quite a bit as you go. So if you are going to use this method, just chain loosely, just to avoid as much bowing as possible once you start working into that chain. And then my first row, when I am done chaining, I always use the back ridge, so you can kind of see from here those back ridge stitches. That way kind of the bottom chains are flat, so I don't work in like these. I don't do that. I go in to that back ridge. I always start with the second back ridge from hook, so always chain one more than what's requested, if not already mentioned in the pattern. So if the stitch or the piece is 325 stitches across, you'll want to chain 326, and then you'll chain into that second back loop from hook. Obviously you'd have a bunch of yarn with you and beginning the first row in that back ridge. So benefit, chaining 325 stitches is much quicker than doing the foundation stitch, which we'll go over here in a minute. If that's what you're used to, it's perfectly fine, it's perfectly valid. You don't have to worry too much about, losing stitches. You might want to use some stitch markers in the piece, just to, if you are chaining that many. it doesn't hurt that way. So that was just an example of chaining with the first stitch and what it looks like with that first row. So next, what I'm going to go ahead and do is show you how I do the foundation stitch, which definitely there's other YouTube videos that can be done. This actually can be done with your regular hook. You kind of, and I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. So I'm using a 3.25 millimeter hook, which will be used in the rest of the piece. You'll slip stitch onto the hook, and then you're going to start with a chain 2. And then in that first stitch, again, I usually do the back ridge. I'm going to go ahead and put my hook through and pull up a loop. I'm going to yarn over, and I'm only going to pull through that first loop, yarn over again, and pull through both. And then on the back, you're going to go back into both loops of that first stitch, yarn over and pull through, yarn over, pull through 1, yarn over, pull through 2. And then you'll go back into the stitch that you just made, pull your yarn through, yarn over 1, yarn over, pull through 2. So you can kind of see it basically ends up looking like you chained and actually went back in and did your first row in a single color. I'll keep going a little bit. So you can kind of see what that looks like. So the actual top of the piece is going to be, you know, this part. So you can see that's the back. And so when you start your first row, if you're working right to left, you'll actually start with the first stitch that you made on the chain. And it looks like this. So it is going to be a bit bulkier for your piece, but what this does is, you know, if you don't like necessarily working in a chain, if you have a tendency to chain a little bit too tight, like I had an issue mainly with where my pieces were just bowing, I never could quite get the chain tension to match what my actual piece was. So basically I like this because I can use my same hook. I can create basically my initial chain with the same gauge, so you know, this way across, and when I go in to do row 1, I'm only going to work in that back loop like that on this foundation chain, and it's so much easier to slip in and out than trying to find that back ridge of that chain stitch, especially when you're carrying yarn, and that's going to be how the piece is worked. And yes, you'll have a line here, so if it doesn't bug you, like it doesn't really bug me to have, you know, kind of a thicker outline on one side, but in some pieces you might be able to do your last row in a single color just so those match a little bit, if you are worried about it. But other than that, it does take longer obviously to do 325 foundation row stitches than it does chains, but in the end, like I said, it has a little bit more substantial feel, you know, to hold in your hand, because you do have to do a lot of manipulating to get into the back ridge, as well as carry this other 6 colors, 5 colors, whatever you're carrying across. And that's going to be how I do the foundation row. And I've done anything from like 180 for a small lap blanket to well over some of the wall hangings and stuff when I work bottom to top. So the long part of the piece can be upwards of 325, 350 stitches. And so usually that foundation row, as I go, I'll count up to either 50 or 100 depending on how many I'm putting, and then I put a stitch marker, then count another 50, 100, so you're not trying to keep track of too large of numbers. And it makes it easier if you do just want a foundation stitch across while watching a show, and you can go back and count later. So hopefully that helps. Let me know and we'll go from there. Thank you.